Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to CIBC Presents Entrepreneurship 101. As you can see, we have a panel format tonight on the topic of governance, boards of directors, boards of advisors, and such things. Now, our moderator tonight will be Ron Close. And about a month and a half or so ago, I introduced Ron as a seasoned entrepreneur, executive, and board member. Well, he's even more seasoned since a month and a half has gone by. Last time, I think I highlighted Ron's background. He is executive entrepreneur in residence at the Richard Ivey School of Business. And I think I went through a lot of his experience with companies and so forth. Tonight I want to emphasize he's a member of the board of directors of Mars Innovation. He's a board member and audit committee chairman of CTV Globe Media, which is Canada's premier multimedia company. A little ad there, I guess. He has been a board member of Inukshuk, which was Bell's pre-WiMAX wireless joint venture with Rogers. He's been a director and a CEO of Nextair Inc., which was a publicly traded wireless software company. My point of raising those is that I think that it makes him eminently suitable to be our moderator on today's panel on the issue of boards and governance. And Ron, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the other panel members.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks. Everybody hear okay and see okay? It's going to be a casual format. We've got some discussion on some points. We're going to talk about advisory boards and boards of directors. And we'll define those and talk about the differences and what's appropriate when, and perhaps some tripwires and traps to avoid if you're thinking of pulling together boards yourselves. But before we do, I wanted to introduce our three other panelists today. We've got some pretty seasoned people who have been both at the executive rank and the director ranks. And starting immediately on my right here, Dave Pasieka has had several executive roles at Bell Canada, CNCP Telecommunications, Unitel, Metronet, AT&T, 724, Oasis Technology, eFunds International, IC Media, Bulrush Clean Energy, Luxel Technologies. In fact, he can't hold a job, I think, right? Is that what it is? Recently, he's been focusing on high-potential companies in the clean tech sector, including Blue Sky Solar, Bulrush Clean Energy, Ecologic, Zero Footprint Software. He has experience in Europe, Middle East, Asia, North America, as well as virtually all of the corporate functions up to and including CEO. He chairs the audit committee of the board of IC Media, the HR committee of the board of Luxel Technologies. He also sits on the board of Oakville Hydro as the chair of the HR committee there. Among other duties, he's a member of the faculty of McMaster Directors College and Not-for-Profit Governance Institute, and he sits on the mayor of Oakville Sustainability Advisory Group. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Waterloo, an MBA from Schulich, and his chartered director from McMaster University. So Dave, welcome. Beside Dave is Kerri Golden. Kerri has an HBA and undergrad biz from the Richard Ivey School of Business. Yay, Ivey, that's my alma mater. Earned her CA designation while at KPMG, was a pioneer in the wireless communications business, holding senior positions with Rogers Wireless and with Bell Mobility. Served as a CFO for a couple of public companies, Alliance Atlantis Communications, Loris Therapeutics. Also served on the boards of several private companies, including Atsana Semiconductor, Avendo Wireless, Chantry Networks, HGTV Canada, Life Network, Meriton Networks, Natural Convergence, and Spotwave Wireless. Kerri's been very active in securing financing of over $1 billion in equity and debt, and in negotiations on a number of merger and acquisition transactions. Until early 2008, Kerri was a managing partner at Primaxis Technology Ventures, currently serves as a mentor in startup organizations, raising capital, and working here with the Mars Social Entrepreneurship and Mars Advisory Services teams. Kerri, welcome. Another very qualified panelist here. And at my far right, Bill Wignall, a good friend, a very seasoned and senior executive and board member with a very long list of roles and accomplishments. Most recently, CEO of a company called Truition. He was asked to take over the company by VC investors to identify a path to profitability and value creation. He was the CEO of Electronics Workbench, where he virtually rebuilt the company through organic growth and M&A, merger and acquisition activity, culminating in an extremely successful sale transaction of the company to National Instruments. He's held various positions with technology companies from startups to multinationals. A BASc in electrical engineering from U of T, graduated from the executive management program at Stanford, Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He's a director, or has been a director of Triant Technologies, Averna Technologies, on the advisory board and cell therapy program for Princess Margaret Hospital, Truition Board, Electronics Workbench Board, and he chairs Altruvest Charitable Services Board. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the backgrounds there just to let you know that, well, at least I have gray hair. These guys are masking it somehow. You know that's the truth. And we want to now sort of open up the cupboard and tap into some of their experiences. We're going to look at each of advisory boards and boards of directors in some detail. But before we really dig into this, let's just take a second to define and differentiate advisory boards from boards of directors. And I wonder, Dave, if you would mind starting us off by describing each of these two structures and pointing out some of their differences.
Excellent, okay. Well, I'd like you to think a little bit about a triangle. So think about the top of the triangle as management, and the bottom left-hand corner would be shareholders, and the bottom right-hand corner would be a board of directors. This would be a structure of a typical organization that's incorporated. And the board is typically hired, is elected by the shareholders of the corporation, and by law, their mandate is to look after the best interests of the corporation. And by definition, the interests of the corporation are many, and there are many stakeholders who sit under that umbrella. So there could be employees in there, there will be shareholders in there, there'll be bondholders in there, there will be equity folks in there. So their mandate is to look after all of those stakeholders and ensure that the best interests of the corporation are being looked after by management and by the board. The advisory guys, a little bit different. Think again at the top of the triangle where management sits. And here, the board advisory guys are coming in at the top, and they're there really to help management execute its mandate. So think about the board of advisors being hired by management to help them accelerate the commercialization of the entity. So in simple words, I think that's how you would differentiate the two.
Kerri, Bill, anything to add on points of differentiation between those two entities?
Should I go?
Go for it.
So I would say that Dave did a good job. The most recent information as tested in court generally and as a result of recent financial crises over the last couple of years has broadened the definition of which set of stakeholders a board has to pay attention to. So Dave listed, I don't know, Dave, how many? Shareholders, bondholders, employees, and it's gotten broader still to the point where the mandate for the director is take care of the corporation and any stakeholder that might include. So it might include suppliers that have not been paid. It might include customers for whom, if the company goes belly up, are left in a manner that's not...
Or pensioners, for example.
Or pensioners, exactly. So the definition of the corporation that the directors are there to serve a fiduciary responsibility for is broadening, I would say.
This was one of the, just on that point, it was one of the key issues in the go private transaction with BCE of a couple of years ago. Some of you will remember how Teachers was trying to buy Bell Canada Enterprises, and one of the issues that tested was the fiduciary responsibilities of the board of director to constituent groups beyond the shareholders. There had been historically, I think, sort of a groundswell of popular opinion that the board was there to look after the interests of the shareholders. At the shareholders' election, at the shareholders' vote of confidence, putting them on the board. But indeed, in that process and other processes as tested in law, it now seems to be settling down that the board of directors have multiple constituent interests that they have to look after, not just shareholder interests.
And further to that, Ron, it's more complicated if you're a corporation that does business cross-border, because cross-border, the role of the board is to look after the shareholders, which is different than the stakeholder view. So if you're a board of director with a company like BCE, they had a tricky little path to follow, and ultimately it went up to the Supreme Court.
Absolutely.
And that particular point was, well, it's a Canadian corporation, therefore it's governed under the laws of looking after the stakeholders as opposed to the shareholders. So very interesting as you get into cross-border governance and what the directors have to do.
Kerri, I think you were going to weigh in
Yeah,
there.
I was just going to add one more point on the BCE case. It's kind of interesting for those social entrepreneurs that are in the audience. We've recently published a white paper about different types of structures for social businesses, and it's the BCE case that we actually refer to that really brings the community or the environment or other elements also into the purview of the directors for a socially oriented company. And so it's interesting. We worked with an organization in the US, which is obviously having to work hard to bring those elements into US law, because in the US, they are mostly responsible only to the shareholders of an organization, whereas here in Canada, we really do have that precedent and an old one from People's Jewelry many years ago that actually say that Canadian directors have always been responsible for the whole. Certainly not maybe to the same extent. They don't have the same rights as a shareholder would have that has money into the company or a debt holder, but certainly that their interests should be considered.
So still staying with both advisory boards and formal boards of directors, how do you know, Kerri, if you need an advisory board, if you're an entrepreneur setting up a company or you're a year in or 2 years in, how do you know when you need an advisory board, or do I need a board of directors? Do I need both? Do I need neither?
Yeah, and I'll take it one step further, because it could be just an advisor rather than a full advisory board as well. And so I think what you want an advisor or an advisory board for is to add to the expertise you don't have in your own organization. So clearly lots of entrepreneurs, I think of the two guys or girls in a garage that have a great idea, and they really, maybe have a couple of specialty areas themselves. So oftentimes they're very technically focused. They may not have as much expertise around, customer and customer engagement, sales and marketing type initiatives. They may need expertise from a financial advisor. And so, it's kind of looking at what your business needs at that stage. And so a formal board of directors, is clearly required if you're going to raise money from other people, generally speaking. If you're just yourself, or yourself and someone you've worked with a long time, or a friend or a family member, you may not need formal governance to run that structure for you. But what a formal board can do for you earlier in your life is perhaps give you some credibility elsewhere. So that could be, as I say, for investors, but it may also be for customers or partners or other people you're engaging with. So it may be something you want to point to earlier to say that I have so-and-so on my board that has this business and industry experience or customer experience.
Kerri, I want to poke at one of the things you said about if you're going to raise money,
yes,
you may be better off having a formal board of directors.
Yes.
But if you raise money, don't those investors often want to come in and populate the board themselves? What comes first?
I would say that it's true. I mean, obviously, I sat on the investor side of the table for 10 years representing an investor on a board, and they generally will put their own people on, but they generally also have, a desire to have the board comprised of people that also represent the founders. So the founder may himself or herself be on the board, or someone that's an industry expert. And generally speaking, to have a couple of people on the board to help you negotiate through that financing transaction is a good thing. That person doesn't have to be on the board for the next 10 years. They could be your initial board of directors and stay on the board for a period of time for transition, and then move on to something else if the investors feel that there's someone else that they would like to see at the table representing a specific interest area.
Bill, I'm still a little confused, and I might not be the only one. Before I really want to get into advisory boards, but I'm still stuck on, it seems to me that when you have an advisory board, you populate it with people who can help you in different walks of your challenge. Some might help you get customers, some might help you with technical things, some might help you negotiate an early financial transaction or something like that. So you would populate advisory boards with people who can give you advice where needed. But it also seems, from what you guys have been saying, and Kerri was just talking about this, that a board of directors also is going to come with talent and skills and specific capabilities that you as a corporation are going to need. So I'm not sure how when you choose an advisory board or when you actually make the decision to go with a formal board. Is it as simple as, if I'm going to raise money for debt or equity, and I'm going to go through term sheets and the legal process of issuing shares and whatnot, or convertible debentures, I need the legalities of a board? How do you decide when to put in a board?
Yep. So I think, let me answer it two ways. One is, it can be as simple as you're raising money from outside parties, in which case you're very likely to need a board. In almost every case, I guess.
Why, by the way?
Because the investors will see, as a way to protect their investment, the governance or the oversight that the board provides to the corporation as a means of protecting that investment. The other most common reason for appointing a board, as opposed to using an advisory board or a panel, the less formal, the less official, less legal body, is trying to introduce people to the company in a more tightly bound way that you think you might want to have involved over a longer period of time. So the company may not be at the stage to attract someone to join the organization in I'm in full harness 60 hours a week working now, but I think that might be an interesting company for you, and I think you could contribute something to our business. And if there's a board of directors, it's a little bit more official, it's more binding, the person feels a stronger commitment, there are legal connections in both directions. So that's the other most common reason I've seen.
Okay. Dave.
Yeah, Ron, one additional point which I think is important, especially if companies in the group are going for IAF funding. One of the requirements...
It's the Investment Accelerator Fund from the provincial government.
Yeah, so one of the things there, when you initially incorporate your Ontario Inc. company, on the Articles of Incorporation, you have to have a shareholder or a director, if you will, named. That's the minimum requirement, one director. But as you move up and you start to gather in the financing from other parties, Bill's point is bang on, making sure that that money is well managed. But the Investment Accelerator Fund takes it one step further and says, as soon as we put our money in, we want to see an independent director on the board. And the independent one is not the management, not someone from management on the board, not necessarily someone just running or appointed by the investment fund, but someone who sits in between, who has no formal stake, if you will, in the organization. And I think that's a very interesting point, the whole concept of independent director.
Good point. Good point. Anything to add on advisory boards?
On the independent director issue, I would say that in public corporations, this is much less an issue. There'll be multiple independent directors. It's required now under Sarbanes-Oxley and other legislation. In private corporations, the role of an independent director can be really hairy. It's often the case that there are not very many independent directors on the board of a private company. The directors typically come from management and or from investors. And so it would be quite common to have a board of, 5 directors, 2 from management, 2 appointed by investors, and 1 independent director. And there are multiple situations, many I can think of having lived through myself, where both management and the investors are conflicted, and the only director able to vote on an issue is the independent director. And so that one guy or gal has a lot of, I don't know what to call it, pressure, or it's a hard position. A lot of clout, a lot of potential liability. I mean, if you're thinking about taking on an independent director role for an organization in which you're the only independent, you need to really think through that carefully.
It's going to be tough.
And if you're starting an organization and or raising money and there's only going to be 1 independent director, you as founders should care a lot about who that independent director is.
So to summarize so far, I think I hear sort of a bit of a consensus, although there's probably 1,000 ways to get there from here. But a bit of a consensus that says when you start out, populate an advisory board as needed to get the skill set and an ability to introduce characters and people who you may want to have close to you over time. And as you're starting to need more formal fundraising and processes like that, start thinking about morphing that advisory board into a full-time board of directors or a legal board of directors. Let's drill down into the advisory board side of things. For many of the folks here, they're starting, it's very early stage in companies. And Bill, what do you use advisory boards for? How do you select members? Where do you find them? And how do you pay them, or do you?
Okay. Will you remind me of the second and third parts after I answer the first one? So the first one was, what do I use them for?
I'm not telling you the first one again.
Yeah. How you gonna pay me, Bill?
Yeah.
If you can't keep one question in RAM, Bill, for crying out loud.
Okay, I'm not sure which one this is. But you remind me of the
What
other
do you
two.
use advisory boards for? Let's do it one at a time.
So I think the most common use of advisory boards is to fill gaps in skill sets or experiences. So you as a founder or you as a member of a management team at the early stages of a company might be product-centric. You have a technology background, you've developed some IP, something like that, and come up with the idea for the business, but may not have financial skills or sales and marketing skills, legal skills. And so it's quite common to use an advisory board to associate some people with your organization that can serve as a means of domain expertise in each of those functional disciplines. Question 2 was?
How do you find and select the members, and how do you pay them?
Thank you. So I don't think that finding and selecting members of an advisory board is really that different than finding and selecting members of a formal board, at least from my experience. There's one small difference which I'll touch on and then come back to all the ways they're the same. It is becoming more and more common for boards to use outside executive recruitment agencies to recruit directors, whereas it was not that common years ago. So that's one small difference, which is not typically done for an advisory board. But generally, it's try and identify the skill sets or experiences that you're looking for, and then talk to your network of people to help source someone in that area. If you're looking for legal skills, you go to your outside corporate counsel and say, I need someone to sit on my advisory board with me. Can you recommend someone? If it's finance skills, you'll talk to your outside accountant. You'll talk to your friends and family, business advisors who you respect, suppliers, customers.
And are they typically paid?
Yeah, so my experience is this is one area where advisory boards and boards of directors vary materially. So it's quite common that advisors, or in the informal, less legal advisory board, it's not paid or paid a stipend, if you like. Often it's more common that they're paid in some kind of options in the business or a small equity stake. If you look at the board of directors, that's quite different, but I think we're going to come back to that later.
We'll come back to that. Yeah.
So it's not expected by most people who would step into an advisory role to have this serve as a large portion of income, I would say.
Got you. Dave, how frequently do you meet with advisory boards specifically? And can you talk about the meeting process itself? Is it all together? What are the minutes? How formal is it? What do you send out in advance?
Yeah. What I like to do with my advisory board, and it's the same as the board of directors, I like to lay out a charter, if you will, about what we expect our advisors to do and what we expect our board of directors to do. And the charter, you can simply Google board charter, and it'll bring up a whole pile of stuff associated with the TSX rules. So for my early stage companies, I like to think about these companies as getting onto the venture exchange at some point. So why don't we start with the best principles first, which are build out a charter. The charter simply says, this advisory board are gonna meet to do the following things, ... And the expectation of the individual members are the following. And so in there you could lay out, I would expect that you would attend a half-day meeting once a quarter, once a year, once every 6 months, that you would be available on call when I need you on a periodic basis, whatever that definition is. And the more structure you can put on it, it'll be better for the caliber and quality of the individuals that you'll attract. So you'll be surprised. You'll be able to attract fairly big names if you can lay out an expectation that I'm not going to call you every day, Ron, and I only expect this, but maybe I could expect that if I got a term sheet. And to me, I think that's a good way of sort of, laying the table, if you will, and setting an expectation. And then from there, you could say, if that expectation is really big, then you could attach here's what we will pay you for that quarterly board meeting, and it's $200 of cash, or it's a small number of options that represent X number of the pool. And I think, to me, that's a good way of sort of laying the table out and setting expectations. And then you can decide how you want to do it. Some companies are going one-on-one, so if it's a channel expert who knows the US market forward and backward and sideways, you might want to meet with them one-on-one. But I still think there's an opportunity to bring your whole advisory board together at least once a year so that you can all share the experiences and bridge off each other's experiences. So I like the one-on-one plus the regular meeting, but all of that is laid out in a charter and ultimately a document that you would hand off.
Which is really managed by the founder/CEO.
Absolutely.
To say, what do I need, what advice do I need from my advisors, and structuring it, and delivering that message, and then managing the process.
And it's a simple one-pager, and believe me, it goes a long way. That you look so much professional, so much more professional if you walk in and say, here's my expectation, and maybe 2 signature boxes, and then you've got a way of charting forward from there.
Kerri, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you protect, still on advisory boards, we're going to get to the more formal boards of directors in a minute, how you protect that, manage liability concerns for advisors. Are they liable? How do we insure against that or hedge against that? And how do you set and manage the terms of service for advisors? Is it a 3-year rotating appointment? How do you fire an advisor when they're not giving you what they want, or their usefulness is no longer needed?
Sure. I'll talk about the liability issue first. I mean, technically, as long as an advisor doesn't become a de facto director, and I'll talk about that in a second, because some do inadvertently and by just not realizing that they are, is you really don't have the legal liabilities that a formal director would have of the board. And how you become a de facto director is actually engaging in the activities that a board member would. So there are lawsuits that have been successfully won in the US where an angel investor or someone who's an advisor that doesn't have a formal role on the board becomes very active in the board and the governance of the company, perhaps around a financing transaction or an exit transaction, and really shouldn't be trying to make decisions on behalf of the company or sway others. And if you do that, then you will expose yourself potentially to the same risks and liabilities as if you were a board member. And so, obviously as founders and managers, you want to keep your advisors away from that, and they probably will want to as well, particularly if you're an early stage company, because one of the big liabilities we as directors are responsible for are wages and all those types of things that are owing to people in the company.
Interesting. So their own behavior and how they represent themselves to others can impact legally how they're seen as being liable.
Absolutely. And so how you rotate them out, and it's a sensitive thing. I actually am part of a startup team right now, and we are in the process of rotating a couple out. And so it is something you manage. I think you look at what their contribution has been to date. I think on an annual basis, you want to look at who's contributing what. And if they're not, you shouldn't feel afraid to, stop either paying them or vesting their options. Generally speaking, if you're an early stage company, I say the rule of thumb is if the person's influential in your industry, you don't want to just, take everything away and terminate their rights. You leave them, the compensation for the work they've done up to that point in time, and you kind of move on as friends, and that's fine. And I think advisors expect that as well, because people will be useful to you for specific things, for specific periods of time, particularly around introductions or advice on a product strategy or a channel strategy, and they don't expect that they're going to be there forever. Have you
seen examples of people saying, okay, this is a 2-year posting and we revisit it every 2 years, and we do that so that it's always young and alive, we have new blood and new talent, new ideas? Or is that really a theory that's not in practice?
I see it a lot in customer advisory boards. where you're trying to get different voices of different people around the table. I haven't seen it so much myself, and others might have a different opinion, in more the sort of startup through, revenue generating companies, so much as setting the term. I think boards might do it a little bit. At ours, we vest our advisors' shares over a 2-year period, so it's kind of implicit that that's the period of time that we expect to extract the maximum amount of value for them.
Bill, Dave, anything to add on
I was going to offer
boards?
2 things, Ron. One is on terms, I would say it is very common on boards and not so common on advisory boards, from my experience. It's common on boards just to ease the pain and suffering of having to go to someone who thinks they're there forever and tell them, you're not cutting it, sorry, we need to have a discussion. It's a little bit more awkward if there's not a natural cutoff point where everybody knows the conversation's coming anyway. The second observation I was going to share is you and Dave were talking about with whom the responsibility vests for kind of getting the little board, if it's an advisory board or the more formal board, started and writing a charter, and you both had agreed, and I've seen it done that way lots, so there's nothing wrong with the answer that it may be the founder or CEO who does that. But I've often, maybe not often, I've more frequently seen in recent years a founder or CEO acknowledge that he or she doesn't have that experience, look for someone outside to bring in specifically with that mandate, saying, I think it's time for me to have a board of directors or start an advisory board. I don't know how to do that. You're someone I trust. I've known you or indirectly referenced into you. Would you come on and help me build that? So I didn't want the audience to feel that if it's intimidating for you or you feel ill-equipped to do that on your own, it doesn't mean you can't initiate an advisory board or a board of directors. You can solicit help to do that with you.
Mm-hmm. Dave, anything?
I think the term is more common at the board of directors level. Yeah. Because of the fiduciary accountability, there's usually, you would expect that there'd be a director and officer or liability insurance sort of going with that accountability. And I think the best practice that you want to get to soon with both your advisor and your board of advisor is implementing an evaluation process. And what we teach at the Directors College is quite simple. It could be as simple as, at the end of every meeting, going in camera and going around the table and said, what'd you think of the meeting? Did the meeting work for you? Did we follow the agenda and solicit some very active feedback? The other one that I like is really simple to do is we like to flag heroes and foes. So we have a way of maybe doing that anonymously, and all the information would go up to the chair, and there would be a little handwritten note to say, you know who the hero of this meeting was? It was Bill. And you know who the foe was? It was Kerri. And then the chair has some active feedback from the collective group, and he or she could take that feedback and then have a private one-on-one to say, Ron, you're not cutting it, and we've got some real live feedback. And from there, you can either, start to push a little bit more formally, or you might just decide, you know what, I don't really like to be evaluated around here, and maybe it's time for me to move on. So you might self-select to move on.
This is a great point, Dave, and I think this is, for the folks in the audience, there's no difference. Teams are teams, and groups of people are groups of people. And we have to pay attention to the process and the chemistry and the chemicals in the chemistry. And so, how are people communicating? Are there steam relief valves? Do you have checkpoints where you say, time out, I'm feeling dislocated, I'm being left behind? Are you checking the process of teamwork as it unfolds here on the board? And the board or advisory board is no different than when we're working in any other teams to that extent. We do need to be able to touch base and make sure things are unfolding. I'm wanting, Bill, if you could comment a little bit about this very scary step off the cliff. I started a company a year ago. I've had some advisors that I've pulled in, people that had specific areas of expertise. It's been fairly informal. Maybe I've had one-on-ones with 4 or 5 different advisors with different pockets of expertise, and we've gotten together as a group once or twice. But I'm now needing to raise some dough. I need to raise $3 or $4 million, and I know that the investors are going to demand some more formal directors and boards be put in place. How do I do this when I run the show? it's my baby. How do I take that leap to say, I'm now prepared to give a lot of control up to a chairperson, to boards of directors? How do you get through the eye of the needle as a founder?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's any silver bullet for that one, so I'll talk about it a bit. But it is a bit of a leap of faith, I have to confess. First of all, I think it's important to really understand where the power dynamic resides between shareholders and boards and management, and your ability as a founder or management executive to decide who is on the board depends entirely on your shareholders. So as we've talked about in other settings, Ron, you bring in some outside investment that ends up having an investor with 33% of the company, and you still own 2/3, the board is perhaps a slightly less scary situation for you. If the board's not working well or an individual director is not working well, you call a shareholder meeting. Directors are appointed based upon shareholder votes. You have more than half the votes. You decide who the director is. That's one level of scary. The next level of scary is now you have 50-50 or 49%, and you don't automatically control who the director is, and that is a little bit more intimidating still. What I would say is, appointing directors is different if they're independent directors appointed by you as shareholders or you and other shareholders versus somebody coming in and appointed by an investor in your company. And we were joking about this outside earlier. I'm going through one right now where we took some money, about $20 million from a large pension fund, and the CEO and founder is struggling a bit in the relationship with the appointee on that board. And I joked with I chair that board, I joked with the CEO saying, you can get rid of me in 30 seconds. Here's how you do it. No, I don't want to get rid of you, Bill. You seem like a nice man and you're trying hard. And you can get rid of Mark and you can get rid of Brock. That particular person you can't get rid of. They're there as the appointee of someone who put in $20 million to the business. So there's all these different levels of scary, I would say. There's quite a bit of legalese being discussed about which legislation and fiduciary responsibility and directors and officers liability insurance. I would say that boards are an area where legal advice is really quite important. So if you don't have it, having somebody on the board or inviting your outside counsel into board meetings like that can help.
So the food chain, if you will, of power and authority starts with shareholders who nominate directors, who oversee management as they execute the business plan, approve the business plan, approve compensation plans, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
This is where it gets to be really sensitive in terms of dilution if you're raising money, because you're not only a manager when you're an entrepreneur and a founder, you're management and you're manager. You're also a director, probably, but you're also a shareholder.
Sure.
And to that extent, which hat am I wearing at which time? And am I prepared to dilute to raise the sorts of money? Because that'll compromise my control and authority as a shareholder, which is that sort of ultimate food chain. Kerri, I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the separation of duties between chair and CEO.
Okay, sure. And I want to just talk to that for a second too, because I am an investor who has removed other investors from the board. And so I wouldn't want to leave you with the impression that just because someone wrote a really big check, if they aren't acting in their best interests and the fiduciary duty of the company, then you can engage other members of the board. It's a delicate situation, clearly. I mean, you're not going to just, fire them from the board that day. But there are ways to go to their partnership and their fund and talk through what some of the issues are if it really isn't getting in the way of you running your business. And Tony and I have had to do that a few times. And it's not comfortable for anybody, but it's better for everybody if it's dealt with. And so the separation of duties from the chairman and the CEO, clearly the CEO is the person managing the day-to-day operations of the business. And so the chairman shouldn't be, going out and giving direction to all of the employees in the organization or even the next level down. But he or she obviously does have the role of ensuring that both the board is functioning properly and that the CEO is getting feedback from the board about his or her performance. And so really the separation goes to, day-to-day versus ensuring from a long-term strategy perspective that that governance body is actually working properly. I mean, that's the way I describe it. I don't know if these guys have something else to add.
Yeah, I would think of it almost like a line. So think of maybe Conrad Black over at this end of the spectrum, and maybe Larry Ellison over at that end of the spectrum. So at this end, with Conrad, of course, you know, the reason he got into trouble, he was basically driving the whole, you know, management and board agenda, and they were basically signing off. And that was a really significant governance failure. On the other side, I don't think the board can tell Larry Ellison too many things. And so you've got the CEO in complete command and control over here. And you know, so you've got a spectrum somewhere, you know, in between. And actually, the example I wanted to use was a board, like a not-for-profit board over here, would be more in control of an organization than the CEO and management. And they're usually fairly large boards. So think about the spectrum of Conrad and Larry over here and the board over here. And somewhere in between is where you want to find the bright red line. And part of it is the chemistry between the CEO and the chairperson. And so if you're the first-time CEO looking to hire, that or to find your chairman, that's the most important hire that you can do. Someone who knows about governance, knows about how this company needs to grow over time as it moves on to the venture exchange and up to the TSX, and knows that you're a small startup with 15 people, and the governance book, okay, can't be drop shipped onto the desk, and you expect everyone to kind of operate that way. So I think the key is understanding there are two ends of that spectrum, understanding you want to be in the middle, and then working very closely with your chair to try to figure out where that line is and how you shift that line over time.
Just before, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I was going to say the relationship between the chair and the CEO is a fuzzy gray one at best. In almost all boards, it can be good and fuzzy and gray or bad and fuzzy and gray, depending upon the point of view of each. But it's not one of those things that can be written down explicitly and that's the chair role, go do that. Because, you know, Kerri's absolutely right. You as a CEO don't want the chair, you know, calling in to your senior VP of sales saying, you know, why didn't you follow up on this lead? You know, that. On the other hand, it is absolutely expected, reasonable, desirable that the chair has his or her finger on the pulse about what's going on at that next level down. If there's a mutiny brewing, right, and the board's completely oblivious and doesn't see it coming, it has no idea because their view is that's the CEO's job. We only talk to the CEO. We're the board. And all of a sudden, you know, 4 out of 5 people on the executive team quit and the company's left exposed, you know, then the board has done the corporation a disservice. So, you know, the board is one of those fuzzy gray areas, you know, and you know, as an example of that, I would say the general expert opinion, people way smarter than me who do governance as a living, are debating right now around the world about how much power to vest in the chair. And we were talking about this outside, right? And you know, there's no right or wrong answer. Different countries have different points of view on it. Sometimes you see the you know, the ringing effect or an overshoot for you engineers that, you know, there's a problem that materializes like the financial crisis, and everybody runs to regulation to help tighten up, but it over-regulates a little bit, and then it comes back down, and it kind of, you know, naturally settles out at an equilibrium point, and we're kind of there right now. The world's gone through a very hairy time. More power has been described as potentially being good in a chair in some areas of the world to offset the power of the CEO. And in other areas in the world, they don't agree with that. It's viewed as the responsibility of the board needs to be shared amongst the directors. So,
with so many of these things, the complexities and the nuances mean that experience helps. If you've been through it and screwed it up a couple of times and gotten yourself into some trouble a couple of times, I think you learn a little bit. And in lieu of that experience, when we are starting out, over-communicate. talk to people, include them in what you're thinking and why you're doing what you're doing. And I think you would find that people will rally to help and to encourage and to share their expertise and opinions with you more openly if you're openly communicating and asking. I'm going to open up the floor in just a minute for some questions. I want to make sure we have sufficient time to air any thoughts or concerns or questions you guys may have. But I also wanted to give each of the three panelists an opportunity, just unfettered. Are there any battle scars? Are there any significant hard lessons earned and learned about boards, advisory boards, or formal boards of directors? And maybe, Dave, you can start us off. Anything you just want to say as a watch out or don't forget or one of the best things or worst things I've learned or have done?
Absolutely. Well, one of the key duties of a board member, a formal board member, is to hire and fire the CEO. So back to your thought, how does this feel when you hire your first board of directors and you get them in there? Suddenly now, by law, the dynamic has changed because their accountability is to actually monitor the performance of the CEO and the organization. And it's very interesting. I've seen a lot of early stage companies who suddenly don't understand the dynamic of having that board and that fiduciary accountability of the board having the right to hire and fire and push them out of the way. So that, I think, is an interesting one that needs a little bit of communication at the front end and also ongoing communication as you evaluate CEO performance and the board evaluates itself as to how it moves forward.
Thanks, Dave. Kerri, any specific things to share?
Yeah, I think where I've seen boards have the most trouble sometimes is when you go for the rock star or the person who is someone from your past that you have a really, really strong relationship with, and how those can go wrong. So my rock star story is that you bring in the CEO of one of your major customers and you find out that that major customer then excludes him from all of the purchasing of any of your product for a period of time, and you have to manage that in the organization. Yep. So instead of having a customer sitting right there at the table, you now have a legal organization in a big company that's really stopping you actually from doing business with that company particularly. Plus that person is extremely busy and may give you 5 minutes a quarter beyond attending the board meeting. And the other one is that person from your past. And the person from your past, you may not see the pros and cons of that person and how they react with the rest of the dynamic of the board, but they also may see you in a very junior role. And I've seen that where I've brought my boss from my last job in, and now I am the CEO and this is my company, and they treat you very much like the person that was working for them for the last 15 years. Yep. And that's not a really good dynamic that you want to set up in your board.
That's a good point. Thanks, Kerri. Bill?
Okay. Could I do two quick ones?
You bet.
Yeah. First one I would
if you can remember both of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Would you remind me the second one?
Thank God you didn't say three.
The first one I would say is there's been a lot of discussion so far about what I might call the functional expertise you might look for in board members. So someone with legal expertise or financial acumen or something like that. And that's necessary for sure. You want to be really thoughtful about picking people that have those right sets of skills and experience. I would say it's necessary but not sufficient, to use a little bit of math lexicon. It's the most common mistake I've seen both as a CEO of lots of companies and as a director and board chair is insufficient time paid to looking for the right kind of communication style and management style between the CEO and the board or the CEO and the chair. If you're the kind of person who's very passionate and emotional and volatile and screaming's part of the way you manage your day-to-day business, you don't want someone for whom that's offensive, and vice versa. You're a CEO who's very calm, never loses his or her patience, never escalates, and you have a director come in who just screams. That's not good. The second thing I would say is be aware of kind of the unspoken rules of engagement between the board and management. So in both directions, what I try to advise my CEOs about is the responsibility of management is to prepare adequately when sending information to the board so they come to the meeting ready to have a discussion. Not too much. Lots of first-time CEOs send out, 154-page PowerPoint deck. That's too much, right? So not too, but not too little that the board feels unprepared to have the discussion. And in the other direction, the responsibility of the board is to be respectful of management. Lots of boards think they're so important and so special, and there are all these really, highly known people out there, and so they're going to control their own agenda in time, and you ask management to prepare on a topic, and they spend 5 nights until 4 in the morning, because for them, preparing the material for a board meeting is really important. And now it's 6:30 and dinner's starting and we're out of time, and sorry, that just has to wait till the next quarter. And that's not cool either. So those are my 2.
Got it. Good points.
What's your third one, Bill?
Okay, let's open up the floor. There's a couple of microphones. You're welcome to stand and use the mic so we can hear you. And let's start us off. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I was most recently with a small biotech startup, actually listed on the TSX. The company had been around for about 10 years. But the board chair is an individual who had and has a lot of expertise in the industry, but serves on multiple boards, and like 10 plus, and a lot of startups, and some in the same space. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that situation.
Board directors sitting in potentially competitive situations. Have you seen that before, and how have you handled it?
I'll go first.
Hey.
I mean, investors sometimes will sit on multiple boards because that's their job. And so they aren't doing other jobs. So, while I wouldn't really want to do 10, honestly, if they're really early stage companies, you will find multiple directors. You should obviously look for conflicts. Most good investment firms will not put the same partner on a fund and will create some sort of a Chinese wall inside their organization to manage that conflict if they do in fact invest in 2 companies that might be competitive. But certainly from an independent director, the board should be dealing with that issue if the person is sitting on another board with a conflicting company. It really shouldn't be allowed to continue.
Usually, if the board's working the right way, and if this is a TSX venture organization, there's a lot of reporting that has to happen through that whole process. And for each board meeting, I think the rule of thumb is something like a 9 to 1. So a board meeting of 1 hour might take 9 hours of prep. I'm sure as the audit chair for CTV, you don't spend 30 minutes flipping through the deck before you walk into the thing. So it's something like a 9 to 1 ratio. And so as a result, I'd be very wary of putting someone on your board who is already sitting on more than 3 boards, because they're not going to be able to give you the time of day necessary and the attention that you want as a CEO or management team.
I would add on that point of competition, and on the CTV board, for example, Torstar is a shareholder, and Torstar, David Holland sits on our board, who is now the CEO of Torstar, and Rob Pritchard before him. And there were certain topics that were not sent to him, and there are certain discussions that he must excuse himself. Pamela Wallen, who is now a senator, is on the board, and there are certain things that she can't participate in, and government guidelines of that. So behind and underlying all of this stuff is transparency. All of the board members, each of the board members knows where the other board members are, interested, and where the tripwires may be for conflicts of interest. And if that is front and center, you can manage these things either in camera or removing some of the package that's sent out for the print, for example, elements of the Globe and Mail, so the Torstar doesn't see it. It's doable. Nice to avoid it if you can, but transparency, I would say, is a key element. Yeah. Let's move to the other mic.
Sure. So for nonprofit corporations and social enterprises, where there are no shareholders and sometimes not even members, who is the board of directors responsible to?
You want to go first?
Yeah.
Go ahead if you want.
Actually, this is the interesting thing about not-for-profits, that those board members have the same fiduciary accountability as TSX Ventures or whatever. And so they could actually be brought to task. And especially around, you think about a not-for-profit that's raising money. you're taking money from the outside and bringing it into your corporation and then figuring out what you're going to do with it. So in fact, I'm sure there's a lot of directors sitting on not-for-profits, and they have no idea what kind of doo-doo they can actually be in, assuming the management team starts to take the money and spend it on vacation somewhere. So same accountability, it's just not that well known. I know both the Directors College in Mac and the Rotman School are both running a not-for-profit board training program. And so there's lots of different ways that organizations that don't have that money can get up to speed, but you do have to get up to speed if you're sitting on one of those boards.
And just from a legal perspective, they are accountable to the member. Just like a company has to have at least one shareholder and one director, there has to be at least one member to get your objects through legally to the government. So there will be at least one person in that nonprofit that the directors or director would be accountable to.
Often the directors are the members
exactly.
in not-for-profit organizations. And the last thing I would say is, Dave's right, most of the reputable university-based directors training programs have a not-for-profit stream or specialty program. There are also specialty not-for-profit director programs. I think it's called BoardWorks in the US, Board Match is one in Canada. A board that I chaired used to take CEOs from the private sector who run corporations and train them in not-for-profit board governance to place them onto charitable boards for the purposes of growing the charitable sector. So there are ways to get the specific set of differences for not-for-profits by going through only a few days of training, if that's something that's interesting to you.
Next question, please, sir.
Actually, I just have a couple of quick questions. One is on the differences between the CEO and the chair, but the confusion usually I have is president and CEO. I see people that are chaired and CEO or chaired CEO separate people, and sometimes you see CEO president or just president and CEO or chair CEO and president. So on the CEO president, what's the difference there? And the second question I just wanted to ask is on the liability issue. Usually you're told that if you have a sole proprietorship, you are liable personally for property and all that. If you incorporate, you minimize that. But if you're a board member, I mean, you're still liable. And I just wanted you to elaborate a bit more how much is that liability and how you can protect for that.
First on the president, CEO, any comments? Go ahead, Bill.
What I would say is I'm not surprised that it's more clear to you what the difference is between a chair and a CEO versus the CEO and president. Because most people are more confused by the president-CEO fuzziness. It's very clear that a CEO is member of management. It's a full-time job. You're making the operational decisions. A chair is a member of the board, in some way leading the board. Sometimes there's a lead director role as well. But they're not a member of management usually. And the separation of chair CEO is becoming more and more common. The president CEO thing is so fuzzy, I don't even know how to answer it. I mean, it changes from company to company.
I'll try a little bit legally. It's interesting. The concept in legal is the president really is the operating person of the company. And CEO is something that's come about as companies have gotten larger and you have divisional presidents, et cetera. And so I think in most small companies, they are pretty much doing the same job. The CEO and the president in a smaller organization.
I can just support that. I felt in my company, I started a small company in one of the early ISPs called Netcom, and I was embarrassed to call myself CEO. We had 3 amigos in my basement, right? And we grew to 180 people doing $30 million, but I was still a president of it. There wasn't a CEO role there. And I think as Kerri's suggesting, there's an executive element of the title CEO, an executive element, like there's executive offices. And presidents of divisions, executives overseeing the operating presidents of divisions. So my own bias about that is just call yourself a president if you're a founder of a small company, and when you get so big that you need to hire a president underneath you who has cross-functional responsibility for a P&L and a full business entity, think about your title then.
But if the gentleman in the audience is trying to understand what the difference is in any particular company he's looking at, there's no ability to rely upon that
Completely
already.
variable.
It's just all over the place.
And Dave, can you comment on the liability issues of, yours was specifically liability of directors.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, there are a couple of liabilities, and it's usually back to the payroll. And so ultimately, you're personally, jointly and severally liable for making sure that the company can pay off essentially the government. It's all the it's the UI and the unemployment insurance, all those sort of taxes. So when a company folds under, the board is accountable to pay the government some of those line items, and that's where it gets tricky. So how does a board protect? Well, what they do is they put together director and officer liability insurance, which protects them against sort of fraudulent things that are happening in the organization that they didn't know anything about, or environmental spills that are beyond their control. The second thing that they do is they put together their director toolkit. And the director toolkit, Bill alluded to it, crisp agenda, smart materials that are issued in advance, decisions to be made about certain things. And the other thing in the director toolkit is to ask a ton of questions, especially if you don't understand. So through the questioning process, the discipline of having materials come through, and a level of detail that fits the right comfort of the board that you've got, those are the 3 or 4 things that the board has at its fingertips to watch the trajectory of the company and to avoid going into that ugly spin and becoming bankrupt and insolvent.
The gentleman behind you has been standing there for a while. Let's go to him next. Thank you for those questions.
Yes, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Oslan Lewis. I'd like to ask you 2 questions. The first question would be, is there anything that you've done in the last year that you wish you hadn't, relating to a board? And the second thing is that we started a mobile technology company very recently, and we funded the early stage seed part out of our own pockets. And so we've done a lot of research, a lot of feasibility studies before we usually do anything. We do the feasibility study, we do the pre-marketing, so we get a sense of where the market actually is going instead of just starting a company and then just, go at it, right? Because as you're working through things change as you move forward.
It's not bad to think first and plan first.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. So, so my 2 questions is actually, what's the things you've done in the last year that you wish you hadn't? And, if you're starting a company, what would you do? Thank you very much.
Sorry, the second question
The second question is that we started, like I said, a mobile media company, right? Yeah. We use no application or no downloads. We figure a way of being able to do it because downloads and applications only 1.5 times every use. So if you're starting something new like this and, you work from a pre-feasibility point of view, what would be the next logical stage to do without having to get this, like we developed disruptive technology, but what would be the next stage that you would normally do if you were, say, in our position?
Got you.
Thank you.
Well, who wants to fess up to the things you did in the last year?
I've actually been pretty good in the last year, but I will admit to having been sued as a director of a company.
Oh, very cool.
For shareholder oppression, which is something obviously that exists here in Canada and the US. I don't think I did anything particularly oppressive. It was, a financial terms of an agreement that an investor that was an existing investor in the company took exception to. And that happens a lot in bad economies. So, companies valued at $5 million today and it can't raise any money, and that investor did not want to participate, and so therefore didn't like the fact that the existing investors would fund the company but at a lower valuation. And so I think, the lesson from that is, everyone has to remain calm. You have to work through the issues. We settled the matter without having to go into court, et cetera. But just, those things are going to happen, and you're going to learn from them, and it will be in your experience book. So I'd rather avoid it, though.
Any other comments before, or perhaps on the second question?
The third question was no. The first question was around regrets, and I had one of those situations where I was appointed as the independent director between 2 founders who owned the company, and I think the regret I had, I lived through this situation for a year. And in the end, the management voted, the two guys voted against this really significant term sheet and valuation because they didn't want to dilute. And in the end, so I was the lone voice saying, no, I think this is a good valuation based on the market. And then what ended up happening is the company then got really desperate for cash, and they had to take a valuation which was a third of what the original deal was. And as I tried to unravel the situation in my own mind, I think it came back to the chemistry at the front end of the thing. Had I spent more time with the CEO talking about my role and my accountability to vote for the things that I felt were good, and not necessarily would pad your pocket or do your dilution. And so I think in retrospect, I would have spent more time working the chemistry angle that Bill talked about earlier. And that's a regret that I had. And so now moving forward, all the things that we talk about are really around chemistry and fit and what value can I uniquely add. And oh, by the way, you realize now, as the independent, I gotta make the tough choices in the best interests of the company, not in your personal pocketbook. Right. And I would do that different.
Just quickly on the second question, the second part of your question before we move on, because there's a couple other gentlemen there. I think that your story of the software company, the mobile company that you're starting is exciting, and you're in the midst of a startup. And with a startup, in terms of the sequence of events, you start with a thesis, with an idea in mind that there's some chunk of a market that's currently being underserved. And the market is this big, and you start thinking about the size of the market, how to segment the market, and is it attractive? And then you look at the competition to really identify how and in which ways is it being underserved, and can I fill that hole? Can I fill that gap? Market's there, really needing something. Competition's there, but not somehow adequately satisfying that market need. Therein is your opportunity. Then you start peeling the onion, and there's operational planning and financial modeling for sensitivity and pricing and economics and legal and HR and forming the team and raising the money, and that is the stuff of entrepreneurship. And congratulations, because you're right in the midst of it.
And that stuff all comes before the board.
And all that stuff comes before
back
the board.
to
Right on.
Yeah.
Right on.
Next question. As a startup entrepreneur, I'm in the process of putting together a board of advisors. Yep. And so could you touch a little bit more on, and keep in mind that this is a startup and we're not heavily financed. So what kind of compensation, can you talk about compensation options and examples of things to consider for startups? I know I can read annual reports to find out what the big companies are doing for their board.
But we've already said usually advisory boards are not paid.
Not paid. So
not in cash, because your cash is too dear.
Vested, over 2 years. So like what kind of equity? I mean, I'm just looking for benchmarks, right?
Yeah, actually, I'll put a little plug in for the Entrepreneur's Toolkit on the Mars website. So we have some articles out there, and there is one, I think it's called Allocating Stock Options. And in there we give an idea. So to me, it's like 1/4 to 1/2 point of your company, perhaps. If it's really, really someone good, you might go to 1% to 2%. I think most people will tell you that if somebody wants a lot more than that, then they're probably just more interested in making money than really helping you build your business, and that's probably not who you want at this stage.
And I think the key piece to that is if you're going to go do that, then make sure you have a charter, you have an expectation of what you want, and you have a way, and the lawyer can help you with that document or whatever, but you have a way that if they're not performing, and maybe it's because the options vest over a 3-year period, and it's tied into the charter. So here's it's like management performance review. Here's our expectation. Here's how you're doing, okay? And guess what? We're going to vest you this year. And as a bonus, you can stay on for next year too. So that's a subtle way of doing it. But I would introduce those concepts of expectation, performance, and a vesting period.
We just have time for one more question. Sorry, thank you for those. And last question, and then we're just going to wrap up quickly.
Sure, actually, you just answered my first question.
Okay.
Second one about the board of advisory. I'm curious to know, is it really important to have a structured board of advisor for a startup? Because as a startup, when I actually go out and talk to people, people just, if they like me or if they're interested to help out, they just answer questions. If I bring out a piece of paper and that relationship might break, and they'd be like, I don't want to spend 4 or 5 hours structured to help you out every month. if you have questions, just give me a call. So I'm just curious to hear your feedback.
Good question. How formal should it be? Can't I just take a bunch of different people out for a coffee whenever I need to pick their brain?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely up to you. You know, if you feel like you're getting or will get the best value from having those more ad hoc conversations, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I would not want you to take away from this that one of the first things you should do in an early stage startup is set up an advisory board. You know, Ron talked about financial plans and operational plans and hiring a management team. All that stuff is more, maybe not more important in the long term, but more urgent. It needs to happen first. So if you're happy with the more informal structure, I think that's fine.
I think when you start to look for financing, you know, and if you're two people in a basement, you're going to need to have a way of making sure and providing comfort that your company is bigger and has a vision that it can execute, and it's surrounded with the people who can help you move it forward. So very quickly from those informal phone messages, et cetera, if you're moving down a financing path, you want to be able to look like a credible organization that is grooming to Zoom. And that's a way of doing it.
Thanks. Thank you. Just, yeah, please, go ahead.
Real quick, do you have any books or resources that you recommend if we want to look more on best practices to go through this process?
Art of the Start, Guy Kawasaki. Best book.
Thanks, Kerri. That was quick. I would just like to...
A little bit about everything. And it's very
Anything
readable.
specific to managing boards of directors?
He's got chapters on everything about a startup.
Just with an eye on the time, I know we've stayed a little bit over, but firstly, on behalf of my friends on the panel here, we totally admire and respect where you guys are sitting today and tonight with your entrepreneurial education underway, your aspirations, and you're going to make things hum. And on the other side of the coin, on behalf of the audience, we have some pretty incredible talent and a lot of seasoning up here in the panel here. And please give them a warm welcome and thanks. Thank you, guys.